The security camera in the corner of Sable Creek Grocery caught all of it, but nobody watched that footage until it was almost too late. Malik Turner was 17 years old, wearing an apron with someone else's name tag pinned crooked to the strap, and he had $12 folded twice in his back pocket, the last $12 he owned in the world until Friday. He was not planning to spend it on a stranger. Frank Depew, the store's general manager, had been watching Malik for 6 weeks, the way a man watches a stove he doesn't trust, certain that sooner or later something was going to boil over. He was watching that afternoon, too. From the far end of aisle 9, through the front windows, past the cart corral, out toward the parking lot, where a woman he didn't recognize sat with her engine running and her phone raised. Frank thought he knew exactly what kind of trouble was about to happen at Register 3. He did not know the half of it. Because by the time the register light stopped blinking red, one boy's last $12 would already be moving through more lives than anyone standing in that store could have guessed. And it would take months, a video nobody meant to shoot, and one very old woman's very quiet secret to make Frank understand exactly what he'd been looking at all along. Malik's alarm went off at 5:40 every morning, and every morning he let it ring twice before he moved, because those 2 minutes were the only part of the day that belonged to nobody but him. The apartment on Willowmere Street had 3 rooms and 1 working radiator, and in the winter the whole family slept close to it in shifts they never had to discuss out loud. His mother, Renee Turner, worked days as a home health aide for an agency that paid $14.50 an hour, and nights cleaning 3 floors of a downtown office building for cash that went straight into a coffee can labeled rent in Sharpie. His sister Jaslyn was 10, missing her 2 front teeth, and convinced that the tooth fairy had simply forgotten about their building. Malik's father had died 3 years earlier on a construction site 2 counties over. A scaffolding collapse that the contractor's insurance company spent 14 months arguing wasn't technically their liability. The check that eventually came was smaller than the funeral had cost. Malik didn't talk about it much. He kept his father's old level, the yellow bubble kind, chipped at one end, on the windowsill of the room he shared with Jaslyn, not because he used it, but because it had been in his father's hand more than anything else Malik could remember. His grandmother, Ruth, had raised half of Willowmere Street's children at one point or another, including Malik most weekday afternoons until she passed the spring before his junior year. She was the one who taught him the 2 sentences that ran under everything he did: quiet as a second heartbeat, be twice as good, take up half the space. She never explained why. She didn't have to. By the time Malik was 12, he understood exactly what kind of world she was preparing him for. He was not an angry kid. People who met him assumed he would be tall for his age, quiet, careful with his eyes in a way that some adults read as respectful and others read as something else entirely, but the anger, if it existed at all, had been sanded down years ago into something closer to vigilance. He said yes ma'am and no sir without thinking about it. He kept his hands visible in stores out of habit, the same way another kid might keep his hands visible around a nervous dog. Nobody had ever explicitly taught him to do that. He'd learned it the way you learn where the loose stair is, by stepping on it once. At Ridgemont High, teachers described him, when asked, in the mildly approving language reserved for students they hadn't bothered to get curious about: quiet, respectful, no trouble. It was meant as praise. It functioned, more often, as a kind of invisibility, the particular flatness of being noted only for what you didn't do, never for what you actually might. Malik had stopped minding this by junior year, mostly the way you stop minding a low hum in a room you spend enough time in. He'd learned there were other rooms, Mr. Alderman's shop class chief among them, where the flatness lifted, if only for 45 minutes a day, and he'd learned to live for those 45 minutes without expecting the rest of the day to match them. What almost nobody at Ridgemont High School knew about Malik Turner was that he was, by any honest measure, gifted, not in the way that got announced at assemblies. His grades were solid but not spectacular. Because solid but not spectacular was what happened when you did homework standing up in the break room during a 15-minute shift break. What Malik had was his hands. Give him a busted lawnmower, a jammed garage door, a leaking faucet, and he'd have it diagnosed in under a minute, the way some kids could read a page of music without thinking about the notes. His shop teacher, Mr. Alderman, had pulled him aside sophomore year and told him, flatly, that he'd never seen a kid pick up torque specs that fast without someone teaching him first. Nobody had taught him first. He'd just always understood how things fit together. 3 weeks before he ever filled out an application anywhere, Miss Alderman had kept him after 5th period shop class to look at a small block engine that 4 seniors had been fighting with for 2 weeks and gotten nowhere on. Malik had it running again in 9 minutes. A corroded fuel line nobody had bothered to check because the more obvious parts all looked fine, and Mr. Alderman stood there afterward with his arms crossed, not quite smiling, but close. "You ever think about doing this for real?" he asked. "Not just here. Union apprenticeship. Real license. Real money." "Thought about it," Malik said, wiping his hands on a rag that had been red once, a long time ago. "Costs money to think about it for real, though." That same afternoon, Miss Alderman pulled a folded flyer out of a desk drawer he kept for exactly the 2 or 3 kids a year worth handing it to. That was why, 11 weeks before the day everything happened, Malik had filled out an application for the Vance Institute of Applied Engineering, a selective pre-apprenticeship program 2 towns over that fed directly into union electrician and FAC apprenticeships, stipend included, tools provided, a real ladder out and up. 60 kids applied from 4 counties. 14 would be accepted. The non-refundable seat deposit was $75, due by 5 o'clock on the Friday of the week this story happens. And if Malik didn't have it in the office by then, his spot went to kid number 15 on the wait list, and probably stayed there. He had been saving for 11 weeks. He had $63 of it already handed over to the school counselor in an envelope on Monday, and the balance, the last $12, was what stood between him and finishing the deposit on Friday. He kept the $12 in his front pocket, not his back, because his grandmother had also taught him that. He'd learned the front pocket habit 2 years earlier, on a Saturday afternoon at Ridgemont Commons, the mall on the north side of town, where he'd gone with Jaslyn to buy her a birthday present with money he'd saved mowing lawns. He remembered it in pieces, the way you remember things that taught you something without ever explaining themselves out loud. A security guard, maybe 35, falling into step half an aisle behind him in the electronics section. Not obviously, not rudely, just there, the way weather is there. Malik noticed a white kid about his own age 2 aisles over trying on 3 different pairs of wireless headphones, walking in and out of the display without a single glance from anyone, and he noticed himself noticing that, filed it away next to the guard's reflection in the glass case, and understood, at 15, something his grandmother had already tried to tell him in words. Some rooms cost more to move through than others, and the cost is never listed on any sign. He'd bought Jaslyn a coloring set with exact change, kept his receipt out and visible the whole walk to the exit, the way he'd started doing without deciding to, and said nothing about any of it to his mother when they got home. Because there was nothing new to report. It wasn't an incident. It was just Tuesday, dressed up as a Saturday. That was the wound underneath the wound. Not any single humiliation, but the particular exhaustion of narrating your own innocence in advance, every time, to rooms that hadn't accused him of anything yet. Sable Creek Grocery sat on the corner of Route 9 and Ashworth, a regional chain store with green awnings and a parking lot that flooded every time it rained hard enough. Malik had worked there since October, 3 shifts a week after school, restocking shelves and corralling carts for $9.40 an hour, cash he split evenly between the coffee can and his own deposit envelope. Frank Depew had managed the store for 11 years. He was 52, built like a man who used to play some kind of contact sport in high school and never entirely stopped carrying himself that way, and he was, by his own accounting, not a bad man. He tipped his barber. He'd once driven 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring an employee's forgotten insulin to the hospital. If you'd asked him directly whether he treated Malik Turner differently than he treated the other stock kids, he would have said no, and he would have believed it. The truth was more complicated, and Frank had never once been forced to sit still long enough to examine it. He would have said, and believed, that he ran a fair store. He complimented Yolanda's register speed in front of customers. He let a white sophomore named Cole show up 11 minutes late 3 shifts running without so much as a raised eyebrow. None of it registered to Frank as favoritism. Because none of it felt like a decision, it felt like simply liking the people he liked, trusting the people he trusted, and Malik Turner, quiet and careful and new, had simply never made it onto either list, for reasons Frank had never once required himself to name. 6 weeks before the day this story happens, corporate had flagged the Ashworth store for inventory shrinkage, nearly $4,000 unaccounted for over a quarter. A number large enough to trigger a regional audit, and small enough that it could plausibly be pinned on almost anyone. Frank's own performance review was tied to that number. His district manager, a clipped, efficient woman named Patricia Okafor, had told him without much warmth that if the shrinkage wasn't explained by the next quarterly report, he'd be the one explaining it in a different conversation, in a different building. Frank had grown up watching his own father run a hardware store on the east side of town, a store that got, in his father's words, cleaned out slow by 2 employees over the course of a decade before anyone caught on. His father used to say it plainly, at the dinner table, like a weather report, watch the ones who don't look like us. Not because they're worse, because nobody else is watching them close enough to catch them, if they are. Frank had never once questioned whether that sentence was true. It had simply always been there, the way the walls of a house are always there, load-bearing and invisible until something cracks. So when the shrinkage numbers came down, Frank did not sit and think about which of his 11 part-time employees actually had access, motive, and opportunity weighted evenly. He thought about Malik Turner, who was quiet, who kept his hood up in the walk-in freezer, who had started 6 weeks before the numbers went sideways, and Frank told himself that was just good instinct, the same instinct that had kept his own father's business afloat as long as it had, never mind how it had eventually ended. He started searching Malik's bag at the end of every shift. Not the other employees' bags, just Malik's. He assigned him the register nearest the loss prevention camera, told himself it was a coincidence of scheduling. He wrote him up once for a $1.20 register discrepancy that turned out, on review, to be a miscounted roll of quarters that had nothing to do with Malik at all, a discrepancy Frank never bothered to correct in the file. Malik knew. Not the specifics, not the audit, not Patricia Okafor's name, but he knew the particular weight of being watched. The way you know a room's gone quiet behind you even with your back turned. He said nothing about it to his mother. She had enough. He kept coming to work anyway, because $9.40 an hour was $9.40 an hour, and Friday was coming. The rain started a little after 4 that Thursday, the kind of cold October rain that turned the Sable Creek parking lot into a shallow gray lake by 5. Malik was on Register 3, covering for a cashier out sick, when Corinne Boatwright wheeled her cart up to the belt. She was 79 years old, small and straight-backed, wearing a raincoat the color of a mailbox and carrying a purse that had clearly survived several decades and at least one grandchild's crayon phase. Her groceries were modest, canned soup, a loaf of bread, a jar of the cheap peanut butter, a small bag of the good coffee she allowed herself once a month, and she made pleasant, unhurried small talk with Malik about the rain while he rang her up. Her total came to $22.11. She opened her purse and counted out $11 in bills, then began going through a change purse for the rest, her hands moving with the careful precision of someone whose hands didn't move as fast as they used to. Her Social Security check, direct deposited on the 3rd of every month, had been delayed by a processing error at her bank. Something about a routing number update she hadn't fully understood on the phone that morning. She had exactly $11.40 to her name until the bank sorted it out, which the very patient woman on the phone had promised would be 1 to 3 business days. The man behind her in line sighed, loud enough to be heard. A woman 2 carts back checked her watch. The cashier, 16 years old, new, terrified of a line backing up, glanced toward the manager's office with the particular panic of someone who has no idea what the policy is for this exact situation. Corinne Boatwright did not panic. She had lived 79 years, most of them harder than this one moment, and she began, calmly, to set items back. The coffee first, then the peanut butter, doing the math in her head the way she'd done math in her head her whole life, out loud almost, murmuring that'll bring it down to, "I've got it." Malik had come around from behind the register. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't done the math first, hadn't thought about Friday or the $75 or the $63 already sitting in an envelope in a counselor's desk drawer. He'd heard the crack in an old woman's careful counting voice and moved before he'd finished deciding to. He pulled the $12 from his front pocket, a folded 10 and 2 ones, soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded all week, and handed it across the belt. "Sir, I can't take that from a customer," the young cashier said, glancing nervously toward the office window. "I'm not a customer right now," Malik said. "I'm buying her groceries. Ring it up separate if you have to." Corinne Boatwright put her hand flat on the counter, on top of his. "Young man, I can't let you do that." "You're not letting me do anything," Malik said. "I'm already doing it." It cost him $11.11 of the 12. He told the cashier to keep the other 89 cents for her trouble, and when Corinne tried, one more time, to argue, he just shook his head and started bagging the soup. "What's your name?" she said. Not really a question. An old woman filing something away. "Malik, Malik," she repeated, like she was making sure it would stay. "I'm going to remember that." He walked her cart out to the curb himself, because that was the other thing his grandmother had taught him. You finish a kindness all the way to the door, or you didn't really do it, and neither of them noticed the woman parked 3 spaces down, engine running against the rain, phone raised, filming through her windshield because the scene through the front window had first looked like it might turn ugly, and she'd wanted a record of that, just in case. Simone Boatwright Reyes was 29, Corinne's granddaughter, and a segment producer for WCLT News 8, the local affiliate 2 towns over. She'd come to pick her grandmother up from the grocery store the way she did most Thursdays, and she'd started filming out of the low, practiced instinct of someone whose job was noticing things. A raised voice, a stiffening line, the particular tension of a public moment about to tip one way or the other. What she got instead, 26 seconds of it, time-stamped and dated by her phone's own metadata, was a boy in a green apron handing over his own money to a stranger and walking her cart to the curb in the rain. She didn't think much of it that afternoon beyond a small private warmth, the kind you feel and then move past. She didn't post it. She didn't send it anywhere. She just didn't delete it, the way you don't delete most things, out of nothing more purposeful than habit. She had no idea that Thursday that she was sitting on the only piece of the story that would end up mattering more than anything anyone said out loud. Frank Depew watched the whole exchange from the customer service desk through the front windows, and what he saw, a teenage employee handing cash to an elderly stranger at his register during his shift with a car idling suspiciously close in the lot, did not register to him as kindness. It registered as exactly the kind of thing his father used to warn him about. A scheme. A soft con. An old woman being worked by somebody who'd learned to look harmless. He didn't march over. He didn't ask anyone what had happened. He wrote a note in the shift log, MT, Register 3, Cash Exchange DUP Customer Outside Normal Transaction, Monitor, and filed it next to the $1.20 discrepancy that had never been Malik's fault in the first place. 2 files. 2 coincidences of timing. In Frank's mind, they were starting to look like a pattern. The next 3 weeks were quiet on the surface and tightening underneath, the way a rope tightens before it's asked to hold real weight. Corinne Boatwright came back to Sable Creek the following Thursday, not for groceries, but with a card in a cream-colored envelope, addressed simply to Malik, Register 3. The note inside was 4 sentences, written in a careful, old-fashioned cursive that took him a moment to place, thanking him plainly, telling him that whatever the $20 tucked inside couldn't cover, her gratitude would, and closing with a line that stuck with him longer than the money did, "Don't let anybody talk you out of noticing things." It's a rarer gift than people admit. Malik tried to give the 20 back, and Corinne refused to take it, telling him with a small, immovable smile that she'd had worse fights than this one and lost plenty of them, so don't get your hopes up. "I really don't need repaying," Malik said. "This isn't repayment," Corinne said. "This is investment. Entirely different animal. I'd like updates on it, if you don't mind." He kept the 20. He put it toward Friday's deposit. Except Friday had already come and gone by then, and he'd made it, barely, walking into the Vance Institute office with $75 in mixed bills 11 minutes before the deadline, his hands shaking not from cold. He was in. 14 seats, and one of them was his. He didn't tell Frank. He told his mother, who cried at the kitchen table in a way that made Jaslyn ask if something was wrong, and Renee had to explain, laughing through it, that nothing was wrong. That everything, for once, was exactly right. Corinne came back a third time 2 weeks later, not for groceries either, this time trailing a delivery driver, hauling in a stack of flattened boxes for the stockroom. A route driver named Desmond, who'd clearly known her for years. Afternoon counselor, Desmond called across the lot, tipping his cap. "They finally let you retire for real, or you still got a caseload nobody knows about?" Corinne laughed and waved him off. Retired, Desmond, fully. Don't go telling stories. Malik, pushing a line of carts past the loading dock, heard it and thought nothing of it. Counselor. Old nickname, probably. People got nicknames. His own grandmother had been called Sister Ruth by half the block for reasons nobody under 60 could explain anymore. He filed it away without meaning to, the way you file away a house number you'll need later and don't know it yet. Yolanda Price worked the deli counter 3 days a week. 22 years old. A 2-year-old at home, and an associate's degree in accounting she hadn't yet found a way to use. She'd been at Sable Creek longer than Malik, long enough to have learned exactly which manager moods to read and route around. She found him restocking paper towels one afternoon and set her forearms on the shelf edge across from him, voice low. "He do that to you too? The bag thing?" Malik didn't ask what she meant. Every shift. Every shift for you. Every other Friday, back when I first started, before I figured out how to just leave my bag in the car instead of the break room. She shook her head. Filed a complaint about it 18 months ago. Regional never called me back. Stopped bringing a bag to work instead of fighting it. Seemed easier. Is it? Easier? Yolanda considered that longer than the question probably deserved. "No," she said finally. "It's just quieter." Not the same thing. She squeezed his shoulder once, the particular brief solidarity of two people who'd recognized the same weather system moving toward them from a distance, and went back to the deli counter before Frank came around the corner. Malik didn't know it yet, but Yolanda's 18-month-old, never-returned complaint was sitting in a regional HR file cabinet, 3 towns over, waiting for someone to finally cross-reference it with something else. Frank's own Friday that week went differently. Patricia Okafor called him at 6:40 that evening, after the store had closed, her voice flatter than usual over the phone. "I've looked at the shrinkage trend again. It's not leveling off, Frank. It's climbing. I've got a call with my own VP Monday morning, and I need to walk in with something better than we're looking into it." "I've got a lead," Frank said. "I told you that already. You told me you had a feeling about one employee. That's not a lead, that's a liability if it's wrong." A pause, papers shuffling on her end. "I'm coming out Monday afternoon myself. If you don't have something concrete by the time I get there, I'm bringing in corporate loss prevention. And Frank, that's not a conversation about the store's numbers anymore at that point. That's a conversation about your file." Frank hung up and sat alone in the dark of his office for a long time afterward. The particular stillness of a man doing math on his own life that he didn't like the answer to. He thought about his father's store again, the calls that stopped coming, the neighbors who found somewhere else to be, the particular shame of a family business quietly failing in front of everyone who used to shop there. He did not, even now, think to ask himself whether the math he was doing on Malik Turner was the same kind of math, or whether he had simply found, in one nervous 17-year-old with a hood up in the walk-in freezer, a shape convenient enough to pour 6 weeks of dread into. He cut Malik's hours that weekend, quietly, without explanation, from 3 shifts down to 2. The kind of small, deniable punishment that never shows up on paper as punishment at all, just a scheduling adjustment, business as usual, nothing anyone could ever ask him to account for. Malik noticed. He didn't say anything. 2 shifts a week instead of 3 was $18 fewer, a specific, concrete thing he'd have to make up somewhere else before the program's second payment came due next semester. And he filed that worry away too, next to all the others, the way he'd learned to file things, quietly and alone. At home that same weekend, the radiator was doing its usual thing, clanking twice, going quiet, clanking twice more, like it was deciding whether to fully commit to the winter, and Renee sat at the kitchen table with the electric bill open in front of her, doing the kind of math where you move the same $40 between 3 different columns and it still doesn't add up any better the 4th time. They pushed the shut-off notice back 2 weeks, she said, mostly to herself. That's something. I can pick up an extra shift, Malik said, then caught himself. If Frank ever gives me one back. He cut me down to 2 this week. Renee looked up sharply. Cut you down? Did he say why? Scheduling, Malik said, in the flat voice he used for things he didn't fully believe either. Don't worry about it, Ma. I've got the second deposit payment covered either way." "You've got a way of saying don't worry about it that makes me worry more, not less," Renee said. But she let it go, because she had her own $40 to keep moving between columns, and there was only so much worrying a person could carry in one evening before something had to be set down. Jaslyn wandered in halfway through, missing tooth grin fully deployed, holding up a hand-drawn note she planned to leave under her pillow that night, several dollars worth of expectations printed in crayon. Malik read it, laughed for the first time in days, and told her the tooth fairy had probably just been dealing with a lot of teeth lately, city-wide, and to give it one more night. He put $2 under her pillow himself after she fell asleep. It came out of the 20 Corinne had given him weeks earlier, the part he hadn't put toward the deposit. He didn't tell anyone that part. Some kindnesses, his grandmother used to say, you finish the quietest of all. By the 5th week after the deposit, the district audit had come back worse, not better. The shrinkage number had crept up another $600. And Patricia Okafor had scheduled an in-person visit to the Ashworth store for the following Monday, the kind of visit that ends careers if it goes badly enough. Frank did not sleep well that weekend. He thought about his father's store. He thought about the particular quiet of a family business failing, the calls that stopped coming, the neighbors who suddenly had somewhere else to be. He did not think, even once, about whether he had actually looked at anyone besides Malik Turner as a possible explanation for $4,600 of missing inventory. It did not occur to him that the shrinkage had, in fact, nothing to do with any employee at all, and everything to do with a faulty scanner at the self-checkout kiosks that had been under-recording certain barcodes for months, a fact that would surface eventually. In a maintenance log, nobody had cross-referenced with the loss report, filed by a technician who had no idea what his routine service call would eventually undo. None of that mattered yet. What mattered, that Monday morning, was that Frank Depew walked into work with Patricia Okafor, due at 2 o'clock. A shrinkage number with his name attached to it, and a shift log with 2 entries under MT. That he had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of Saturday night, added up to something. Malik came in for his 4 o'clock shift straight from school, still in the same gray hoodie he'd worn all day, his backpack over one shoulder. Jaslyn had walked over from the elementary school 3 blocks down, as she sometimes did on the days their mother worked a double, to sit on the bench by customer service and do her homework until Malik's shift ended and they could walk home together. Patricia Okafor arrived at 1:52, 8 minutes early, sharp-suited and unsmiling, and Frank met her at the door with the shrinkage report already printed and highlighted. "I think I know what's been happening," Frank told her, low, before she'd even set her bag down. "I've been watching one of the part-timers. Cash discrepancies. Suspicious transactions with customers. I want to pull his bag today, in front of you, so you can see it firsthand." Patricia looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that, if Frank had been capable of reading it correctly, would have told him she was already skeptical. That "I think I know" was not the sentence of someone who'd done an actual investigation. But Frank heard agreement in her silence, because it was the answer he'd already decided to hear. At 4:20, in front of the customer service desk, in front of Jaslyn doing multiplication tables on the bench, in front of 6 or 7 customers waiting for the pharmacy window, Frank Depew called Malik Turner over and told him to empty his backpack on the counter. "For what?" Malik asked. His voice didn't rise. He'd had practice at this exact register of feeling, keeping it level. "Store policy," Frank said. "Random bag check." "It's not random if it's just me," Malik said. "You've checked my bag every shift for 6 weeks. Nobody else's. Empty the bag, Malik." Jaslyn had stopped doing her homework. She was watching, 10 years old, pencil frozen mid-number, watching her brother's hands shake very slightly as he unzipped his backpack and turned it upside down on the counter. A math textbook, a half-eaten granola bar, a spare shirt for after his shift, his father's yellow level, which he'd started carrying to school that week for a shop project and hadn't taken back out yet. Frank picked up the level, turned it over like it might explain something. Put it down. "There a reason you're carrying a tool out of the hardware aisle?" "It's my dad's," Malik said. "It's not from this store. You can check the serial, it's not even a brand we carry." Frank didn't check. He was already reaching for the phone at the customer service desk, already dialing a number he'd decided, sometime over the weekend, he would eventually need. "I want a patrol unit out here," he said into the receiver, low but not low enough. "Possible theft, employee. I want it documented before anything walks out of here." Patricia Okafor, standing 3 feet away, said nothing. Later, she would tell an internal review board that she'd assumed Frank had grounds she wasn't seeing, that 11 years of managing a store had to count for something, that she'd trusted his read of his own employee over her own instinct, which had been, from the first sentence out of his mouth, quietly wrong. Jaslyn started crying before the patrol car even pulled into the lot. The 2 officers who arrived were professional, unhurried, and entirely willing to let a store manager's certainty stand in for evidence he didn't have. They asked Malik to step outside, into the parking lot, in view of the pharmacy window, in view of the bus stop where 2 of his classmates happened to be waiting, in view of his 10-year-old sister, who was told by a cashier to sit back down and wait, "Sweetheart. It'll just be a minute." They asked him for ID. He gave it. They asked him if he had anything in his pockets he wanted to tell them about, and Malik, who had emptied a backpack containing nothing but a math book and his dead father's level, said, "No, sir. There's nothing." Because there wasn't. They did not handcuff him. That detail would matter later, in the specific, small, insufficient way that at least details always matter. At least they didn't handcuff him. At least it was only 11 minutes. At least no charges were filed on the spot. It would not matter at all to the part of Malik that stood in the rain-slick parking lot of a grocery store where he had given away his last $12 5 weeks earlier, watching his sister cry through a window, understanding with total clarity that none of the 11 weeks of saving, none of the $75, none of Mr. Alderman's letter of recommendation or the 14 out of 60 acceptance would matter one bit to the 2 officers doing paperwork on the hood of a patrol car if this went the way Frank Depew had apparently decided it was going to go. Be twice as good, his grandmother had told him. Take up half the space. He had been twice as good. He had made himself as small and as careful as a person could make himself, and it had not, in this parking lot, on this Monday, made one bit of difference at all. Renee got the call at 4:52, 4 minutes before the end of her shift, and drove to the store still in her scrubs, running the last 30 yards across the lot in shoes that weren't built for running. By the time she arrived, the patrol car was gone. Malik was sitting on the curb outside customer service, with Jaslyn pressed into his side, his backpack repacked with everything back inside it except the sense, on his face, that anything about the last hour had made any sense at all. Frank Depew had already retreated to his office. He did not come out to explain himself to Renee Turner, then or in the days that followed, and that particular silence, the specific cowardice of a man willing to make a decision in public but not willing to stand behind it in front of the person it landed on, would matter later, in ways Frank hadn't thought through yet. Renee didn't yell. She'd learned, over 17 years of raising a black son in a world that kept finding new registers to be afraid of him in, that yelling in these particular moments cost more than it bought. She knelt down in the wet parking lot in her work scrubs, took both of Malik's hands, and asked him the only question that mattered. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," Malik said, which was, for him, close to a scream. She drove them home in silence, Jaslyn asleep against the window inside 8 minutes, Malik staring at the level sitting in the cup holder where he'd shoved it without thinking. It wasn't until Jaslyn was in bed and the radiator had done its 2-clank routine twice that Renee finally sat down across from her son at the kitchen table and let herself cry. Not for what had happened, exactly, but for the particular exhaustion of having warned him about this his whole life and still not having been able to stop it from happening anyway. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I know. I need you to actually know it, not just say it." Malik was quiet for a long time. "I gave a woman my last $12 because she needed groceries," he finally said. "And 6 weeks later, 2 grown men in uniforms searched my backpack in a parking lot because of it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, Ma. I don't know what the lesson's supposed to be." Renee didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Not that night. She just reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture, though neither of them would ever know it, that Corinne Boatwright had made across a register belt 6 weeks earlier. And they sat like that until it was late enough that sitting like that was the only thing left to do. He didn't sleep much. Somewhere around 2 in the morning he got up, took his father's level down from the windowsill, and just held it for a while, turning it over the way Frank had turned it over hours earlier. Except Malik wasn't looking for evidence of anything. He was just looking for something steady to hold on to that had belonged to somebody who'd loved him without ever once needing to check. He did not go back to work the next day, or the day after that. He told his mother it was because his shifts had already been cut anyway, which was half true, and he told himself it was the same thing, which was not true at all. Mr. Alderman found out from another student, the way most teachers find out anything real about their students' lives, sideways, incomplete, days late. He called the apartment that Wednesday evening, and Renee handed the phone to Malik without a word. "I heard what happened," Mr. Alderman said. "I'm not going to pretend I know what to say to make it better, because I don't think there is anything. But I want you to hear this from somebody besides your mother. Nothing about who you are changed in that parking lot. Not one thing." Malik didn't say much. He didn't have much to say yet. He went back to work that Thursday. Not because anything had gotten easier, but because Yolanda had left a note in his apron pocket the day before, deli counters not the same without somebody to complain to. And because his mother needed the $18, and because staying away, he was starting to understand. Cost something, too. A different kind of tax than the one he'd already been paying his whole life. Corinne Boatwright was not at the store that day. She heard about it 2 days later, from Desmond the delivery driver, who mentioned it the way people mention small-town news, offhand, at her mailbox, not realizing what he was handing her. "Shame about that stock boy at Sable Creek," he said. "The tall one, real polite. Manager had the police out there Monday. Heard he's not even coming back to work there." "Which one?" Corinne said, though she already knew, the way you know a name before you're told it. "Tall, carries himself careful, doesn't he? Register 3. That's him. Malik, I think." Corinne Boatwright stood at her own mailbox for a long moment, holding a stack of catalogs she wasn't going to read, and felt something she hadn't felt in almost 15 years of retirement, the specific, cold clarity of a case forming. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Corinne Boatwright had been before she was the quiet woman in the mailbox raincoat. She was 9 years old in 1960, growing up 2 states south, sent by her mother to the corner store with exact change and firm instructions to come straight home. She remembered, more than 50 years later, the particular quiet of a downtown lunch counter the week grown men and women her father's age sat down at seats that weren't supposed to hold them and simply did not move, no matter what was said to them, no matter how long it took. She remembered her father, a quiet, careful man who rarely raised his voice about anything, coming home that week different, straighter, somehow, like something in him had been given permission to stand up. She went to law school 17 years later, one of 6 women in a class of 110, and spent the next 4 decades as a civil rights attorney, first with a small firm that mostly lost. Then with a regional legal aid organization that started, slowly, over the decades to win. Employment discrimination cases, housing cases, one long, grinding case against a police department's stop-and-frisk pattern that took 9 years and ended. Finally, in a consent decree that changed how 3 counties trained their officers. She had been called counselor by people who'd known her 40 years and by people who'd known her 4 minutes. She had retired 11 years ago, mostly, though mostly was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She still kept her bar license active, still took the occasional pro bono matter that crossed her path in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like an old habit refusing to fully retire alongside her. She had watched a teenage boy give away his last dollar to a stranger without a single second of hesitation. The kind of instinct you cannot teach a person who doesn't already have the bones of it in them. She had spent 40 years learning exactly what that kind of instinct was worth, and exactly how often the world made people pay for having it. She was not going to let this go. She went to the apartment on Willowmere Street 2 days later, on a Saturday, with nothing in her hands but her purse and the particular directness of a woman who had spent 40 years learning that the first conversation in any case should happen face-to-face, not over a phone line. Renee answered the door warily. A stranger on a Saturday afternoon rarely meant good news on Willowmere Street, but softened the moment Corinne introduced herself as the woman from the grocery store, the one your son helped. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Renee had cried 3 nights earlier, and Corinne laid it out plainly. She'd seen the video. She'd heard what happened. She believed she could help. And she wanted, before she did anything else, to ask Malik directly what he actually wanted out of it. Malik thought about that longer than anyone in the room expected him to. "I don't want him to lose his whole life over this," he finally said. "I want him to stop being able to do it to somebody else. And I want to keep my job, because I need the hours. And I want people to know I didn't do anything wrong, not just believe it quietly. Know it. There's a difference." Corinne nodded slowly, the particular nod of an attorney hearing a client articulate, without any legal training at all, exactly the difference between vengeance and remedy that took some law students an entire semester to learn. "That," she said, "I can work with." Jaslyn, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book she wasn't really coloring in, looked up. "Are you a superhero?" "No, baby," Corinne said, smiling for the first time since she'd walked in. "I'm just old, and I know some people, and I don't like watching things stay unfair when I've got the tools to make them less unfair. That's not the same as being a superhero. It's slower than that. But it works, mostly if you're patient." She called Simone first. "You still have that video," Corinne said. Not a question. "The one from the store?" "Grandma, that's 5 weeks old. Why? Do you still have it?" Simone found it in 11 seconds, still sitting in her phone's camera roll, time-stamped, 26 seconds long, showing a boy in a green apron handing his own money across a register belt in the rain. "Send it to me," Corinne said. "And then, I need you to help me find out exactly what happened at that store on Monday, because I don't think it was what the manager's telling people it was." Simone spent the next 2 days doing what she did for a living, just pointed somewhere personal instead of somewhere professional. She pulled the incident report through a records request. Standard and unremarkable, possible theft. Employee, no charges filed, released after 11 minutes. She talked to the 2 officers off the record, both of whom described the call the same flat way. Manager reported a suspected theft. They responded, found no evidence of theft, released the individual. Neither of them had asked Frank what evidence had prompted the call in the first place, because that wasn't, strictly, their job. She talked to the bus stop classmates who'd seen it happen, both of whom remembered a boy standing very still while his sister cried through a window. She talked, carefully, to a cashier who didn't want to be named, who confirmed there'd been a card and a $20 bill weeks earlier. The manager wrote something down that day, too. "I saw him do it. I don't know what." By Wednesday night she had a folder that wasn't a news story yet. She was careful about that line. Careful in a way her grandmother had taught her to be careful about most things, but it was more than enough to hand to somebody who knew exactly what to do with it. Corinne's first call after that was not to Frank Depew. It was to Patricia Okafor, whose name and direct line she found through the store's corporate directory in about 4 minutes. Because 40 years of legal work teaches you, above almost anything else, exactly which door to knock on first. "Miss Okafor, my name is Corinne Boatwright. I'm a retired attorney, and I'm calling about an employee of yours named Malik Turner." There was a pause on the line. The particular pause of someone recalculating a story they'd already decided was closed. "Ma'am, that's a personnel matter. I'm not able to." "I understand," Corinne said. Pleasant, unhurried, the same voice she'd used across a table from opposing counsel more times than she could count. "I'm not calling to discuss personnel matters. I'm calling to tell you that I have video evidence, time-stamped, dated, of the exact transaction your store manager cited as grounds for calling the police on this young man. I'd be happy to walk you through what it actually shows. Or I'd be happy to have my attorney do it in a letter. Your choice which conversation you'd rather have first." Another pause. "Longer. I retired 11 years ago," Corinne added, almost gently. "But I still know exactly how this looks from the outside, Miss Okafor, and I don't think you want to be the one explaining it." The video went to Patricia Okafor at 6:14 that evening. By 6:40, she had watched it 4 times. It showed exactly what it showed: a boy handing cash across a belt, an elderly woman refusing it and being gently overruled, a bag packed, a cart walked to the curb in the rain. 26 seconds. No scheme, no con. No cash exchanged outside of a normal transaction in any sense that suggested anything but a kindness so plain it was almost embarrassing that anyone had needed it explained. Patricia pulled the shift logs next, all of them, not just the 2 entries Frank had flagged, and found what a slightly more careful look would have found 5 weeks earlier. A pattern of bag checks with exactly 1 name in the column, week after week, while 11 other part-time employees went unchecked entirely. She found the $1.20 discrepancy write-up and the maintenance log from the self-checkout technician's visit 3 weeks prior, sitting in a completely different file, connected to nothing. Explaining, if anyone had bothered to connect it, almost the entire shrinkage number on its own. She did not sleep much that night either, though for entirely different reasons than Frank had the weekend before. The meeting happened 6 days later, in the small back office of the Ashworth store, around a table too small for everyone it needed to hold. Frank Depew, Patricia Okafor, a regional HR representative named Deirdre Shaw, who had flown in that morning. Corinne Boatwright, and Malik, with his mother beside him, her hand resting flat on the table the entire time like she needed something solid to hold on to. The room still smelled faintly of the walk-in freezer down the hall, cardboard and cold metal, and Malik noticed himself noticing that. The same old habit of cataloging a room before it had a chance to catalog him first. Deirdre Shaw had a legal pad open to a fresh page. Patricia Okafor had not made eye contact with Frank since walking in. Corinne had brought nothing but a manila folder, unopened, resting on the table in front of her like a card she wasn't in a hurry to play. Frank started defensive, the way people do when the ground has already shifted under them, and they haven't fully admitted it yet. "I had reasonable grounds to be concerned," he said. "The shrinkage numbers were real. I was doing my job." "You had a shrinkage number," Corinne said, calm, folding her hands on the table the way she'd once folded them in front of juries. "What you didn't have was a single piece of evidence connecting that number to Malik. You had a feeling. And you acted on the feeling 11 times before you ever acted on a fact." She slid a printed still frame from the video across the table, Malik's hand extended, the 10 and 2 ones, Corinne's own hand trying to refuse it. "This is the transaction you flagged as suspicious. I'd like you to tell me, in front of Miss Okafor and Miss Cho, exactly what about this looks like theft to you." Frank looked at the still frame for a long time. Something in his face changed, not collapse, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man watching a story he'd told himself for 6 weeks fail to survive contact with an actual photograph. Patricia Okafor cleared her throat. "There's something I should say too." She looked at Malik, then at Renee. "When Frank told me he had a suspect, I didn't ask him what evidence he had. 11 years of trusting a manager's read on his own store meant I skipped the one question that would have stopped this before it started. That's on me. Not just him." Corinne nodded slowly, filing that away the way she filed most things, permanently. "There's also a complaint sitting in your regional file from 18 months ago," she said, turning to Deirdre Shaw. "An employee here named Yolanda Price. Same pattern, different name, no response. I'd encourage you to pull that today, not next quarter." Deirdre Shaw wrote the name down without a word. Renee Turner spoke for the first time since sitting down. "My son missed 2 days of work he needed the pay from because he was too shaken to walk back through that door. I'd like that acknowledged too, not just the shrinkage number." "It will be," Deirdre Cho said. "Back pay, and I'd like to talk about what an appropriate remedy looks like beyond the minimum we're required to offer. My father used to say," he started, and stopped. Started again. "My father used to say you watch the ones who don't look like us. I grew up on that. I never thought about whether it was true. I just thought it was smart." "It wasn't smart," Corinne said, not unkindly. "It was cheap. Smart costs something. Cheap doesn't. Cheap just lets you stop looking." Deirdre Shaw spoke for the first time, flat and procedural. "Mr. Depew, corporate policy requires documented, evidence-based cause for a bag search applied consistently across staff. Your logs show a pattern applied to a single employee over 6 weeks with no supporting incident reports. That's a policy violation independent of anything else in this room." Malik had been quiet the whole meeting, hands folded, the way he'd been taught. He looked at Frank now, not with anger. He'd used up the anger somewhere in the parking lot 5 days earlier, and what was left was quieter than that, and heavier. "You searched my bag every shift for 6 weeks, Malik said. "You never once asked me what I was saving for." Frank looked up. $75, Malik said, "for a program." I made it in with 11 minutes to spare. The same week you wrote in a log that I was running some kind of scheme with an old woman's grocery money. I gave her $12 because she needed $12. That's the whole story. That was always the whole story. You just needed it to be something else. Nobody said anything for a moment. Renee Turner's hand tightened slightly on the table. I'm not asking you to feel bad, Malik added, quieter now. I'm asking you to understand that you had 11 weeks to look at me and see somebody trying, and instead you spent 6 of them looking for a reason not to. It was not a gloat. It didn't need to be. The room understood, in the particular silence that followed, that the truth had just finished doing something a great deal of shouting never could have. The consequences moved quickly after that, and mostly out of Malik's sight, the way they're supposed to. Frank Depew was placed on administrative leave within the week and terminated 11 days later, following an internal review that turned up 2 prior, unresolved complaints from former employees describing a similar pattern of selective scrutiny, complaints that had been logged and never acted on. He did not fight the termination. Whatever else could be said about him, he did not, in the end, pretend the video showed something it didn't. The review itself took 11 days, longer than corporate wanted and shorter than it should have, interviewing 6 current and 2 former employees and cross-referencing 4 months of shift logs against loss prevention footage nobody had bothered to review in real time. It found, in the end, exactly what Corinne's Manila folder had already found in an afternoon. A pattern, not a person. The self-checkout technician's maintenance log was cross-referenced with the shrinkage report within the same week, and the faulty scanner, quietly recalibrated a month earlier during a routine service call, accounted for nearly the entire missing figure. The audit closed without another employee's name ever entering it. Patricia Okafor kept her job, though not without consequence of her own, a formal note in her file, a mandatory bias and accountability training before her next review, and, by her own account to a colleague months later, a considerably lower threshold from that point forward for asking exactly what evidence sat underneath a manager's hunch before she let it become a police call. Sable Creek's parent company, facing the quiet possibility of a formal discrimination complaint that never technically needed to be filed, revised its loss prevention policy company-wide within the quarter, requiring documented, consistently applied criteria for any employee bag search across all 112 stores in the chain. A policy change that outlasted the local news cycle by years, long after anyone outside the Ashworth store remembered exactly where it had started. Sable Creek's corporate office also issued a written apology to Malik and his family, along with back pay for the 2 weeks he'd stayed away from his shift out of a fear nobody made him name out loud, and a formal offer to return to his position, which he accepted on the condition, his condition, stated plainly in the meeting, that bag check policy be applied consistently, logged, and reviewed monthly. Deirdre Shaw agreed to it without argument. Simone's 26 seconds of unposted footage never went to air. Not in the way a story like that sometimes does. Corinne asked her not to run it as a news segment. He doesn't need to be famous for it, she said. He needs to be safe doing it again. Simone respected that, though she did, months later, produce a short, careful piece on selective enforcement in retail loss prevention using aggregate data and no names at all that ran during a slow news week and generated more calls to the station than anything she'd produced in 2 years. 10 months later, Malik Turner stood in the equipment bay of the Vance Institute of Applied Engineering, wearing safety glasses and a set of coveralls with his name actually printed on them this time. Torque wrench in hand, walking a nervous freshman through the exact same specs Mr. Alderman had once told him he'd never seen a kid pick up so fast, without being taught. Malik had finished the pre-apprenticeship program with the second highest practical score in his cohort and was 6 weeks into a real electrical apprenticeship with a union local that paid $19 an hour to start, with raises scheduled every 6 months for the next 4 years. His mother had cut back to one job. The coffee can still said rent on it, out of habit more than necessity now, and Jaslyn had, with great ceremony, been allowed to write tools on a second one, into which Malik still dropped whatever change came out of his pockets at the end of a week. A habit he'd never stopped. Even after the $12 had long since been paid back to him 100 times over by people who never once asked him to pay it back at all. The Vance Institute's deposit requirement changed too, in a smaller way that mattered more than its size suggested. After Simone's segment ran, carefully anonymized, no names, just data on selective enforcement and its costs, a handful of viewers called the station, asking how they could help kids like the one in that story, even though the story never named a specific kid at all. Corinne, who had spent months quietly telling the tale to exactly the right people at exactly the right dinner parties, connected 2 of those callers to the Institute's admissions office within a week. By spring, the program had its first modest deposit assistance fund, $75 a seat, no questions asked beyond need. Seeded by roughly $4,000 in small community donations, and one considerably larger check from a retired attorney who told the program director, when asked how to list the donor, to just write down a friend of the program. Nobody but Corinne, Simone, and the Turners ever knew where the idea had actually started. Malik found out about the fund from a flyer on the Institute's bulletin board, 3 names deep into its first cohort of recipients, and he stood in front of that bulletin board for a long moment before he went and found Corinne's number in his phone. "You didn't have to do that," he said when she picked up. "I didn't do anything," Corinne said. "I made a few calls. You're the one who did the part that mattered, the part where you didn't need anybody to tell you to help her in the first place." Yolanda Price's file got pulled the same week as the meeting in the back office, and the complaint that had sat unanswered for 18 months finally got the response it should have gotten the first time. A formal apology, 2 weeks of back pay for hours she'd quietly absorbed the loss of, and a permanent note in Sable Creek's regional file requiring any bag check policy to be applied uniformly and logged, the same condition Malik had asked for, now covering the whole store instead of just him. She came back to the deli counter the following Monday and left a box of the good coffee, Corinne's kind, on the customer service desk with a sticky note that just said "Thank you, Register 3. Frank Depew, for his part, did not disappear into villainy the way a story like this sometimes lets a person disappear. He filed for unemployment, took a job managing a hardware store on the far side of town, smaller, quieter, no district audits breathing down his neck, and 6 months later, sent a short, unprompted letter to the Ashworth store, addressed to Malik, apologizing without excusing himself, without mentioning his father, without asking for anything back. Malik read it twice, folded it once, and put it in the drawer with his father's old shop project papers, not because it fixed anything, but because it seemed worth keeping proof that a person could be wrong for 6 weeks and still, eventually, tell the truth about it. Renee picked up a better position herself that spring, full-time home health work with benefits, and an actual paid sick day for the first time in 9 years, after her agency's regional director happened to sit on a hospital board with someone who'd heard, through the particular grapevine small cities run on, about that family on Willowmere whose boy did the right thing at the grocery store. Renee never fully confirmed the connection, and never fully denied it either. She just took the job, and the coffee can on the counter stopped needing quite so much math done around it every Sunday night. Jaslyn, for her part, remained entirely unconvinced that any of the adult explanations for the previous autumn added up to anything as interesting as what she'd decided on her own. That her brother had done something so good the whole town had to fix itself around it. She wasn't entirely wrong. She kept the crayon note she'd once left for the tooth fairy taped inside her school folder for the rest of the year. Not because she believed in the tooth fairy anymore, but because Malik had put $2 real under her pillow on one of the worst nights of his life, and some things, once a person understands what they actually cost, you don't take down. 8 months into the apprenticeship, on a bitter gray Tuesday that reminded him of the day it had rained hard enough to flood the Sable Creek lot, Malik was picking up a part at a hardware store across town. Frank's hardware store, as it happened, though neither of them ever mentioned that out loud, when he watched an elderly man at the register come up $11 short on a space heater, the kind of gap in a person's month that has nothing to do with character and everything to do with arithmetic nobody chooses. Malik didn't think about it. He didn't do the math on his own account first. He just reached for his wallet the way he had a year earlier, at a different register, in a different rain. The cashier didn't call anyone over. Nobody watched from a parking lot. It was just a boy, paying forward exactly what had once been paid to him, quietly, all the way to the door. Because some things, once they're taught to you properly, you simply never stop doing. Corinne Boatwright had become, without either of them quite deciding it formally, something between a mentor and family. She came to his apprenticeship graduation dinner. 6 people crowded into a booth built for 4 at a diner 2 blocks from the Union Hall, and told the lunch counter story properly for the first time. The whole of it. The 9-year-old girl and the quiet, careful father who came home straighter than he'd left. Jaslyn, 12 now, both front teeth grown in, asked question after question until the waitress had to come refill the coffee twice just to have a reason to keep listening in. "Do you miss it?" Jaslyn finally asked. "Being a real lawyer?" "I was always a real lawyer, baby," Corinne said, laughing. "I just found a better use for the license lately." She looked across the table at Malik, at the coveralls with his actual name stitched over the pocket, at Renee's hand resting easy on the table instead of white-knuckled around it the way it used to sit. Best case I ever closed, and I didn't even have to file anything. Malik kept his father's level on a shelf in the equipment bay now, next to his own tools, not because he needed it for anything, but because some things you carry all the way through, the same way you finish a kindness all the way to the door. Every dollar that boy gave away came back to him, not as luck, and not as a reward, but as the plain, delayed arithmetic of a world finally catching up to what had been true about him all along.